The small town sat at the edge of thick woods where pine trees grew tall and rivers ran clear. A quiet cabin stood in the middle of that forest. It was built with strong logs and had a stone fireplace inside. Birds often sang on the roof, and deer came close to drink water from a nearby stream. For many years, the cabin had been the perfect place of rest for a man named Daniel. Daniel was not just any man. He was a federal judge, though few people in town knew it. He did not share much about his work. When he came to the cabin, he left his heavy cases and busy court behind. Here, he cooked simple meals, read books by the fire, and enjoyed silence. The cabin was his refuge. Not far from the forest, there was a new housing development run by a homeowners association, better known as an HOA. The HOA had rules about fences, paint colors, trash bins, and even the height of grass in front yards. Many who lived there accepted the rules quietly. Some did not like them but stayed silent to avoid trouble. One spring morning, Daniel found a letter in his mailbox near the cabin. The envelope carried the HOA seal. Inside, the letter said he owed several months of HOA fees. Daniel frowned. His cabin stood on private land, bought long before the housing development was built. He had no contract with the HOA, no membership, and no reason to pay their fees. At first, Daniel thought it was a mistake. He set the letter aside, finished his coffee, and went fishing at the river. But a week later, another letter came. This one was harsher, warning of fines and legal action. Daniel read the words carefully. He had spent years of his life interpreting laws and rules. The letter was full of threats but weak in reason. He knew the HOA had no authority over his cabin. He decided not to reply. Soon, men in neat suits knocked on his door. They introduced themselves as members of the HOA board. Their leader, a man named Harris, spoke with a stiff smile. "You have not paid your HOA fees," Harris said firmly. "Every property in this area must pay." Daniel calmly replied, "My cabin is not part of your association. It is private land. I bought it long before your development." The men exchanged glances, but Harris did not back down. "All properties within our boundary fall under our rules. If you do not pay, consequences will follow." Daniel did not raise his voice. "If you believe that, then take your case to court. But I will not pay what I do not owe." The men left, muttering among themselves. Weeks passed. Daniel returned to his work at the courthouse in the city, but every weekend he drove back to the cabin. He found more letters, each one more aggressive than the last. The HOA threatened liens, fines, and even demolition. Daniel kept the letters in a neat file. His years as a judge taught him patience. He knew rushing to anger was a mistake. The HOA, however, did not know patience. They saw Daniel's silence as weakness. At their monthly meeting, Harris told the board that the cabin owner was refusing to cooperate. He painted Daniel as a stubborn man who thought himself above rules. The board members nodded, agreeing to take harsher steps. Back at the cabin, Daniel sat by the fire one evening, reading through the latest notice. His eyes moved slowly across the page, but his face remained calm. He whispered to himself, "They think this is a game. They do not know who they are dealing with." The forest outside grew dark as night settled. The cabin stood strong under the stars, but storms were gathering. The HOA had made its move, and soon, they would cross a line they could never step back from. Daniel closed the file, placed it neatly on the wooden table, and added a log to the fire. He knew trouble was coming. Yet he also knew something else. Trouble did not frighten a man who had spent his life judging right from wrong. The cabin was his refuge, but it was also about to become the center of a battle. The summer sun was high when Daniel returned to his cabin one Friday evening. The air smelled of pine, and the forest looked calm, yet the mailbox was stuffed again. He pulled out a thick stack of envelopes, all carrying the HOA seal. He carried them inside, set them on the wooden table, and began to open them one by one. Each letter was more forceful than the last. The HOA now claimed his fees had doubled. Another page warned of legal actions, though no court stamp or signature appeared on it. One paper even stated that the HOA had the right to take corrective measures if payment was not made. Daniel read carefully, his brow firm but calm. He had seen many weak arguments in his years on the bench, and these letters were no different. That evening, while Daniel chopped wood outside, a white SUV rolled up the dirt path. Out stepped Harris, the HOA leader, followed by two other board members. They wore pressed shirts and carried clipboards. Their expressions were tight, as if they were preparing for battle. "Good evening," Harris said, though his tone lacked warmth. "We are here to give you one last chance. Pay the fees, or face the consequences." Daniel set down the axe and wiped his hands on his shirt. "I already told you. My cabin is not under your association. You have no claim here." One of the board members raised his clipboard. "We have documents that say otherwise. This whole area falls under our management." Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady. "Show me the deed. Show me the law that binds me to your rules. If you cannot, then stop wasting my time." The men hesitated. Harris forced a smile, but his eyes held anger. "You are making a mistake. The board does not take kindly to defiance." Daniel answered softly, "Neither does the law." The men climbed back into their SUV, and dust rose behind them as they drove away. Daniel stood watching until the sound of the engine faded. Inside the HOA office that same night, Harris slammed his clipboard on the table. "That man thinks he is above us," he said. The other members nodded uneasily. They were tired of arguing with the cabin owner, but Harris was not ready to give up. "If he refuses to pay, then we will act without his consent. That cabin is within our boundary, and it will follow our rules. I will make sure of it." Back at the cabin, Daniel sat by the fire, reflecting. He had stayed patient, giving them chances to correct their mistake. But their pride was growing, not shrinking. He could sense they were preparing something bold, perhaps reckless. He placed the letters back in the file and locked it in a drawer. The following week, Daniel was busy in the city. Court cases demanded his attention, and he spent long hours listening to arguments, reading evidence, and giving rulings. Yet, even in the crowded courtroom, his mind often drifted to the quiet cabin and the storm that was building around it. One afternoon, while walking back to his office, his phone buzzed. It was a call from his nearest neighbor near the forest, an old man named Paul. "Daniel," Paul said, his voice worried. "Strange men were near your cabin this morning. They were measuring things, taking photos, walking around like they owned the place." Daniel thanked him and ended the call. He felt a calm anger inside. The HOA was no longer sending letters. They were preparing something on the ground. That Friday, when he drove back to the forest, he noticed fresh tire marks on the dirt road. At the cabin, stakes with orange ribbons were planted in the soil. A sign was nailed to a tree, reading "Property under review by HOA." Daniel pulled the sign down and studied the stakes. They had not asked, nor warned. They had come without his consent. The line was being crossed. He carried the sign inside, leaned it against the wall, and sat in his chair. The fire crackled softly, but his eyes were sharp. He spoke quietly to himself, "They believe they hold power here. Soon, they will learn what true power is." Far away, the HOA board gathered again. Harris announced proudly that the cabin would be demolished if Daniel refused to pay by the end of the month. The board members looked uneasy, but Harris's voice was full of confidence. He believed Daniel was just a stubborn man who would fold under pressure. What Harris did not know was that Daniel was a federal judge, a man who had seen countless cases of arrogance and overreach. And when the time came, the law would not be on the side of the HOA. The forest was calm that night, but the conflict had grown sharper. A battle was coming, not of fists or weapons, but of law, patience, and justice. The days moved quickly, and the deadline written in the HOA's last letter was getting close. Daniel kept his calm routine. He worked in the city during the week, handling heavy cases in court, and then returned to his cabin each weekend. On the surface, it seemed he was ignoring the HOA, but in truth, he was watching and waiting. The cabin was quiet as always, yet signs of intrusion grew clearer each time. Stakes were planted deeper into the ground, survey markings appeared on rocks, and bright paint lines crossed the dirt near the stream. Daniel photographed everything, placing the pictures neatly into his growing file. He knew evidence was power, and he was gathering it patiently. One Saturday morning, while Daniel fixed the roof shingles, another vehicle approached. This time it was a black truck with the HOA logo painted on the side. 4 men stepped out, not just board members but workers carrying tools and clipboards. Harris climbed down from the passenger seat, his posture stiff with pride. He called out loudly, "We are here to begin preparations. You have failed to pay your dues, so action must be taken." Daniel climbed down the ladder slowly, his face calm. "You have no right to step on my land. Leave before you regret it." Harris smirked. "You can complain, but rules are rules. By next week, this structure will be removed." The workers looked uneasy, glancing at one another. They were not sure about tearing down a cabin that clearly belonged to someone. But Harris's voice was sharp, and they followed his orders. They hammered more stakes into the ground, ignoring Daniel's quiet stare. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply took out his phone and recorded everything. Each hammer strike, each line drawn on his land, every word Harris spoke was captured. When Harris noticed, his smile faded for a moment, but he quickly turned away, pretending not to care. That night, Daniel sat by the fire again. The glow lit his calm face as he opened his growing file of letters, photographs, and recordings. Piece by piece, the HOA was building a case against itself. He whispered to the quiet room, "They think I am silent because I am weak. They will learn that silence can also be strength." Meanwhile, in the HOA office, Harris stood before the board with pride. He spoke of progress, of taking bold steps, of forcing obedience. "The cabin will be gone by next week," he declared. Some board members looked nervous. One woman raised her hand. "Are we sure this is wise? What if the owner fights back?" she asked. Harris waved off her concern. "He is just a stubborn man hiding in the woods. Once the cabin is gone, he will have no choice but to accept our authority." The room grew quiet. A few nodded, some frowned, but no one challenged him directly. Harris had built his power on fear and confidence. Back at the cabin, Daniel took a walk under the stars. The forest air was cool, and the night was full of crickets and the distant call of owls. He stopped near the stream, watching the moonlight dance on the water. Though his heart was steady, he could feel the weight of what was coming. The HOA was planning to cross the final line. They would soon move from threats and markings to real destruction. And when they did, they would be stepping directly into the world Daniel knew best, the world of law. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. He bought extra locks, placed hidden cameras around the cabin, and saved copies of all his files in a safe place. He was not preparing for a fight with fists or anger. He was preparing for the kind of fight he had trained for all his life, a fight that ended not in shouting but in judgment. By the end of the week, a notice appeared on the cabin door, nailed into the wood. It stated in bold letters that demolition was scheduled for the following Monday. Daniel read the paper without flinching. He pulled it off, folded it, and placed it in his file. As he sat at his wooden table that evening, the fire glowing beside him, his eyes narrowed with calm resolve. The HOA believed they had cornered him. In truth, they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. The cabin stood tall under the fading light, but shadows of bulldozers and hammers were drawing near. Daniel waited, steady as stone, knowing the next step would not be theirs alone to decide. Monday arrived with a sharp sound of engines. Daniel was in the city for his duties at court, miles away from the forest. The cabin stood silent in his absence, yet the dirt road shook as heavy trucks rolled in. The HOA had come with workers, machines, and determination. Harris stepped out of his vehicle, chest puffed with pride. He waved his hand like a commander leading troops. Behind him, two bulldozers idled, their steel blades catching the morning sun. The workers hesitated as they looked at the cabin. It did not look like an abandoned place. The walls were polished, the roof firm, and flowers grew near the porch. Everything about it showed care and life. One worker whispered, "Are we sure this is legal?" Harris snapped back, "It is under our authority. Begin now." The workers obeyed. Stakes were hammered deeper, ropes stretched across the yard, and warning tape was tied to trees. Harris stood with his clipboard, writing notes as if preparing a report. Then the machines moved. The bulldozers roared and pushed forward. The sound of crunching wood echoed through the forest as the porch railing snapped. Glass shattered when the first blade hit the window. Birds scattered from the trees, their wings beating against the sky. The cabin that had stood in silence for years was being torn down piece by piece. Logs broke, the stone fireplace cracked, and the roof caved under pressure. The workers grimaced at the destruction, but none dared to stop. Harris watched with a satisfied smile, certain he was proving the HOA's power. By noon, the cabin was nothing more than a pile of broken wood and dust. Smoke rose from the rubble, carrying the scent of crushed pine and burnt wood. Harris planted a large sign into the ground that read, "Property cleared by HOA authority." He clapped his hands, proud of the day's work. "We did it," he said to the board members beside him. "The man will have no choice now but to bend." The men and women around him nodded weakly, though some looked troubled. They had never seen a home destroyed in such a way. But Harris brushed aside their doubts. He believed he had won. That evening, when Daniel drove into the forest, he noticed dust still hanging in the air. As he turned onto the path, his heart tightened. Where his cabin once stood, there was only ruin. Broken logs were scattered, glass sparkled in the dirt, and the stone fireplace lay split in two. The porch swing he had built with his own hands was buried under debris. Daniel stepped out of his car slowly. He walked through the wreckage, his boots crunching over shattered glass. He bent down, picked up a piece of wood, and stared at it quietly. His cabin was gone, torn down without warning, without right. For a long moment, he stood in silence. Anger could have filled his heart, but instead, there was calm. His face was steady, though his eyes carried a quiet fire. He took out his phone, snapping photographs of the destruction from every angle. He filmed the sign planted by Harris, its bold words standing over the ruins like a flag of arrogance. After gathering his evidence, Daniel sat on a fallen log. The forest around him was still, as if waiting for his decision. His cabin had been his refuge, but now it was rubble. Yet within that rubble lay the HOA's greatest mistake. He spoke softly to himself, "You destroyed my home. Now the law will destroy your pride." That night, Daniel stayed at his neighbor Paul's house. Paul shook his head as he looked at the photos. "I warned you they were coming, but I never thought they would go this far." Daniel replied calmly, "They have gone too far, and soon, they will learn what it costs to ignore the law." While the forest grew quiet again, the HOA celebrated in their meeting hall. Harris stood at the front, boasting of victory. "The cabin is gone," he said proudly. "The owner will submit or leave. Our authority is final." But unknown to them, the very act they celebrated had sealed their downfall. The judge they mocked as stubborn was now preparing for a battle in the one place where he held absolute command. The courtroom. The ruins of the cabin remained like scars on the forest floor, but Daniel did not let grief cloud his judgment. The next morning, he drove into the city with his file, photographs, and recordings neatly arranged in a leather briefcase. His steps were calm, his face steady. He had handled cases far more complex than this, but this one carried a personal weight. In his office, he spread the evidence across his desk. Letters with threats, photos of survey stakes, videos of Harris giving commands, and finally, the destruction itself. Each piece told the story of arrogance and abuse. Daniel studied them with the precision of a surgeon, making notes on a yellow pad. By noon, he contacted a trusted clerk to draft formal complaints. The clerk had served under him for years and respected his sharp judgment. Without giving too many details, Daniel explained that a homeowners association had overstepped its authority, destroyed property, and violated rights. The clerk asked carefully, "Will this go to federal court?" Daniel gave a slight nod. "It will, and it will be handled with full weight of the law." Later that evening, Daniel visited his neighbor Paul again. Paul sat on his porch, still shaken by the destruction. "What will you do now?" he asked. Daniel replied, "I will do what I always do. I will let the law speak. They acted in arrogance, but now they will face justice." Word of the demolition spread quickly through the town. Some residents were shocked that the HOA had gone so far. Others whispered that the cabin owner had brought it on himself by refusing to pay. Harris, however, walked with pride, telling anyone who would listen that the board had shown strength. At the HOA's next meeting, Harris addressed the members like a victorious general. "The cabin was demolished as planned. The owner has been silenced. We showed that rules are not optional." The board members clapped, though the sound was weak. A few looked uneasy, knowing in their hearts that something about the act was wrong. But Harris ignored their doubts. He had power in his hands and believed he had won. What he did not know was that Daniel had already filed the first motion. The court would soon summon the HOA, and there, Harris's confidence would meet a force far stronger than his clipboard and speeches. In the following days, Daniel worked quietly. He did not boast, did not show his anger. Instead, he prepared legal arguments with precision. He cited property deeds, boundary maps, and federal laws protecting private ownership. He lined up witnesses, including his neighbor Paul, who had seen the workers marking the land. At night, Daniel sat by his desk, the fire replaced by a lamp, his pen moving steadily. The cabin was gone, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He whispered to himself, "They believe I was silent because I was weak. They will soon learn that silence can also be the calm before the storm." Meanwhile, Harris received the official notice from the court. He read it quickly, his smile fading. It ordered the HOA to appear and answer for their actions. He tried to laugh it off in front of the board, but inside, unease grew. "Do not worry," he told them. "We will argue that the cabin was within our boundary. The court will side with us." But one board member, an older woman, spoke softly. "And if it does not?" Harris glared at her. "It will. Trust me." Back in the city, Daniel closed his file for the night. The case was ready. The HOA thought they had destroyed a man's home, but what they had really done was give a federal judge every reason to put their entire system under the microscope. The forest was quiet now, with only rubble left where the cabin once stood. But soon, the noise of bulldozers would be replaced by the sound of a gavel striking wood, and in that room, Harris's voice would no longer hold power. The courthouse was crowded the morning the case was called. Local residents, curious lawyers, and even a few reporters filled the benches. The story of the demolished cabin had spread, and people wanted to see how it would unfold. Many were surprised when the quiet owner of the destroyed cabin walked in wearing his black robe. Only then did whispers ripple through the crowd. The man they thought was just a stubborn cabin owner was, in fact, Judge Daniel. At the front of the room, another judge would oversee the matter to avoid conflict of interest. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, calm and focused, while the HOA board members filed in nervously. Harris tried to keep his head high, but his face looked pale. He had expected resistance, but not from a man who carried such weight in the legal world. The session began. The court clerk read the charges: unlawful trespass, destruction of private property, abuse of authority, and attempted fraud. The list was long, and with each word, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel rose to speak. His voice was firm but measured, every word carrying the weight of truth. He laid out the facts in order. He showed the letters demanding payment, none supported by legal documents. He played recordings of Harris claiming authority over land that did not belong to the HOA. He presented photographs of the survey stakes, the warning signs, and finally, the rubble left behind after the demolition. The courtroom was silent except for Daniel's voice. He spoke without anger, without boasting. He simply let the evidence tell the story. By the time he sat down, the faces of the HOA board looked drained. The defense tried to argue. Harris stood and insisted that the cabin fell within their boundary. He waved maps that were vague and incomplete. He claimed the HOA bylaws gave them the right to act. But the judge overseeing the case asked simple questions, and Harris's answers grew weaker. "Do you have a deed showing ownership of the land?" "No, but our maps suggest." "Do you have a signed agreement from the plaintiff joining your association?" "No, but all properties in the area are expected." "Expected is not the same as legal," the judge cut him off. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. It was clear that the defense had little to stand on. When Daniel returned to speak again, he closed his file slowly and looked directly at the board members. "This is not only about a cabin," he said. "It is about the abuse of power. When an association forgets its limits and acts without law, it destroys not just property but trust. My home may be gone, but the law remains. And the law will not be bent by arrogance. The words struck like a hammer. Even the audience felt the weight of them. The HOA's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was already done. The judge overseeing the case leaned forward. The evidence is clear. This was an unlawful act carried out under false authority. The HOA will face full accountability. A ruling will be delivered soon. The gavel struck, ending the session for the day. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered quickly. Harris pushed past them, refusing to answer questions. His confident smile from weeks ago was gone. The other board members followed, silent and shaken. Daniel walked out calmly, ignoring the noise around him. A few neighbors came to shake his hand, thanking him for standing up against the HOA. He gave polite nods but did not boast. For him, the courtroom was not a place of pride but of duty. That evening, back at Paul's porch, Daniel sat quietly while the old man poured him tea. "You showed them today," Paul said with a grin. Daniel replied softly, "I showed them nothing more than the truth. The rest will come soon." The forest was quiet under the setting sun, but the storm around the HOA was only beginning. Their pride had led them to destroy what was not theirs, and now the law was closing in. The final judgment was near, and it would not be gentle. The courtroom was tense as the final day arrived. The judge overseeing the case called the session to order. Daniel sat quietly, reviewing his notes one last time. Across the room, Harris and the remaining HOA board members fidgeted nervously. Their earlier confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Daniel rose when the judge asked for closing statements. He spoke clearly, each word precise. "This case is not about anger or revenge. It is about law and justice. The HOA acted without authority. They trespassed, destroyed property, and ignored the rights of a private citizen. The evidence is clear. The deeds, the recordings, and the photographs all prove that this act was unlawful." Harris's lawyer tried to speak, but the judge reminded him that all arguments had already been considered. Harris himself shifted uncomfortably, realizing that no explanation would change what had been done. The judge overseeing the case leaned back and looked at the board members. "Your actions have consequences. Destroying property without legal authority is not simply a mistake. It is a violation of the law. You acted in arrogance and with disregard for the rights of the property owner. The court must issue a ruling that reflects both the damage caused and the need to prevent such acts in the future." Daniel remained calm as the court clerk read the judgment. The HOA was ordered to compensate Daniel fully for the loss of his cabin. The payment included the cost of rebuilding, the value of the property, and additional damages for the unlawful act. The HOA board was also fined personally for approving the demolition without proper authority. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Harris's face turned pale as he realized the scale of the ruling. The fine alone would cost him more than he had ever imagined. The board members sat in stunned silence, some covering their faces with their hands. The judge continued, "This ruling is meant to remind all associations that authority comes with limits. No group or individual can act above the law. The law protects private property and personal rights. Let this case serve as a warning." Daniel sat back down, his expression steady. He had no need to celebrate. Justice had been served. The law had spoken, and those who tried to bend it to their will had failed. After the session, reporters surrounded Daniel. They asked questions about his cabin, the HOA, and the ruling. He answered politely but briefly. "The law is clear. Actions have consequences. That is all that matters. Outside the courthouse, neighbors and supporters approached to shake his hand. Paul was among them, smiling widely. "You did it," he said. "They will think twice before anyone tries something like this again." Daniel nodded quietly. "It is not about them. It is about the principle. The law must stand." Back at the forest, workers began clearing the rubble from the old cabin site. Daniel had already hired contractors to rebuild, and this time, the cabin would be stronger and more secure. He walked through the site, examining the land with careful eyes. The forest around him seemed peaceful, yet full of promise. The HOA board would face the legal consequences for months to come. Their pride had led them to destroy a home, but their arrogance had also brought public scrutiny and financial loss. They had underestimated the man they tried to intimidate, and now they were paying the price. Daniel stood near the stream, listening to the water flow. He remembered the mornings spent fishing, the evenings by the fire, and the quiet nights under the stars. His cabin might have been destroyed, but his resolve and faith in the law had never wavered. He smiled faintly. Justice had been done. The forest was calm again, and his refuge would rise once more, stronger and more secure. The story of the demolished cabin became a lesson for the town and beyond. Arrogance had met law, and law had prevailed. For Daniel, life returned to its simple rhythm, but the world knew that even a quiet man in the woods could command respect when the law was on his side. And so, the cabin was rebuilt, the forest once again welcomed its caretaker, and the HOA learned a lesson they would never forget. Justice had triumphed.